Good day. It is Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023. Welcome to the Corey Morgan Show. As you can see, I am Corey Morgan, the regular host of this. We got to cover lots of issues, cover some ranting, cover some raving, and interview some interesting guests. And I got a good, interesting one coming on today. He's author Philip Slayton. He put out a book recently. He's a Canadian author on anti-Semitism, which is hardly a new issue. Anti-Semitism has been a problem and going on since the creation of Jews, I imagine. But he's got a bit of a different approach to it and a bit of a different outlook in this book on it. I mean, it's not a matter of denying that it exists by any means, but it also kind of goes into whether or not it's perhaps being a bit overstated even. It'll be an interesting discussion. I read the book and it's a most interesting read, so it'll be a good conversation. As well, of course, I'll be talking about a number of issues as we got crazy times going on out there. So, I like to remind everybody too, the reason, that we cover these issues, we talk about these things, we remain independent, is because you guys have subscribed. So I'm going to get that nagging out of the way and get those bills paid. Guys, $99 a year, $9.99 a month. And you get full access past that annoying paywall into all of that content we got. We've got a whole number of columnists and news writers across the country here. And the reason we got them is because you guys have been subscribing. And if you haven't yet, please do, guys. It's well worth it. C11, C18, those media control bills that the federal government is putting in, they're probably going to be coming and being put into force soon. We have to protect independent media. So again, thank you, subscribers. And if you haven't, come on, guys, get on there. I mean, I know the show's free, but the rest of our stuff needs to be paid too. All right, so I'm going to start with kind of on some, this has been an issue lately. So it's about the electoral process. And if citizens, if they don't trust the electoral system, democracy itself is in peril. And it doesn't matter if breaches in the electoral integrity are actually real or imagined. I mean, once the mistrust is entrenched, it festers, and a growing number of people become unwilling to accept electoral outcomes. They could give up on voting altogether, which is bad. But even worse, it could lead to things like the riots we saw on January 6th in the United States on 2021. In Canada, trust in the system is eroding fast right now due to the exposure of Chinese Communist Party efforts to interfere in elections at all levels of government. I mean, that the CCP would try to interfere with elections, that doesn't come as a shock to anybody. Those efforts cause apprehension and people want to ensure those efforts fail, but we know they're going to keep trying. It's the government's efforts to downplay the impact of the electoral interference efforts that are shattering trust in the system. If the Trudeau government gets away with brushing this scandal under the rug, and they might, Canada's democracy itself is going to be at serious risk. Officials keep parroting lines from reports saying the CCP interference didn't change the outcome of the election, as this should comfort us, as if it should. It does appear that the interference, though, has directly compromised at least one Ontario MPP and as many as 11 federal MPs. We're apparently just expected to shrug this off and let it go because it was just a little interference. Now, new evidence is indicating the CCP has been meddling in civic elections in Canada too. Again, I've said it before, Canada needs nothing less than a full public inquiry into the election interference scandal if this virus of electoral mistrust is to be stopped. I understand cynical people when they say such an inquiry wouldn't lead to consequences for the top offenders. They might be right. The exposure of the corruption in the system, though, could force some changes, and people could at least find some remedy at the ballot box. If we don't feel confident we can find remedy at the ballot box, then we aren't in a democracy. Canada's current system of elections, it is actually a good one, though it's been abused. Efforts to reform it, to add efficiency, though, those are only adding, more mistrust and eroding, and it could lead to reduced voter turnouts. For example, we don't need massive mail-in ballot initiatives. There was already a system in place where people who would be away at voting time could vote remotely. I used it a lot when I worked in the oil field. Even if the mail-in ballots aren't being abused, it leaves room for people to claim it has been, and that trust continues to fade. It isn't hard to get out to vote. Polling stations are all over the place, and advanced polls are open for days. Volunteers from parties will literally drive you to the poll and back if you want, and you don't even have to vote for that party when you're there. A little secret for you. If a person can't trouble themselves to vote with that much convenience in hand, I don't really care if they vote. We don't need to hand them the right on a silver bloody platter. Counting paper ballots by hand. It's a slow, resource-intensive process, but it's worked for over a century, and it is effective. Scrutineers from every party can be present to watch every step of the process, from sealing the empty ballot boxes in the morning to opening and counting those ballots at the end of the day. It's terribly tough to rig such a system with all that independent oversight. Now, if we bring in electronic voting machines and counting machines, they might make things faster, but can they be trusted? The vote counts can't be verified by scrutineers with those machines. And let's not pretend that computerized systems aren't hacked constantly. I'm not a Luddite, but I do oppose adding technology to a process that doesn't need it. Now, Elections Canada has just approved a new form of electronic voting lists. And apparently this data is going to be shared overseas. This is a country that's already racked with foreign election interference scandals. And Elections Canada is considering having these voting lists sourced and kept overseas. Sure, it would speed things up at the polls and allow people to vote in more locations, but it's going to digitize a resource and centralize it for prospective abuse. Even if there's no abuse, people are going to suspect it. Some losing candidates and their supporters are surely going to claim that the system caused their loss, and they'll foster rumors. And meanwhile, that, again, ever-important trust continues to evaporate. Canada needs to expose and weed out the electoral interference that's already happened. It has to stop pissing around with the current system of voting and vote counting. Otherwise, the foundation of our democracy will truly crumble. Without trusted elections, we really do have nothing. That's what's got me going today, guys. And I'm saying that, I'll talk a little more about that. The reason I know about this, and a lot of people haven't worked within parties or haven't worked in elections, I've done it. I managed some campaigns. Scrutineering, it's something you don't hear much about. You might notice them when you go in to vote. You go in there and you see some people standing off to the side and they'll be wearing a tag showing which party they're with. And they're not allowed to campaign at you or try to intimidate your vote or push you around. They're just there to watch. And they are allowed to be there for every part of it. Like I said, how do you rig it with paper ballots? How can you pull off that magic? If you've got the parties taking part and having scrutineers in there, as I said, when the polls open in the morning, or even before they open, the scrutineers can come in. They will show you the empty boxes that people put their ballots into and seal them in front of you. So, the box hasn't been stuffed. And you can be there or have other scrutineers on shift there all day watching. And at the end of the day, the scrutineers stay when the boxes are opened up, when the votes are taken out, and they watch them being counted. And every party, at least, is allowed to. Not every party necessarily has the volunteers to do it, but they're allowed to have the people in there doing that. It's a great system. Think about how hard would it be to really rig that. Now, if you start getting electronic voting machines, though, or the counting machines, look at the stuff that went on back with Al Gore and George W. Bush, and it went on for weeks and months, and it just erodes the trust. Why? We don't need to do this. Stick to that. Plus, when you have paper ballots, if there's questions, if there's problems, you can dig out those ballots and go through them all again. And you start going to all these electronics, and I tell you what, it's just a recipe for more problems. And you do have to wonder the motivations of the government and why they want to push for these things all the time. Voter turnouts are going low, but there's so many people saying, well, we got to make it easier. We got to make it easier. Like I said, kiss my butt. Look at what people have gone through to vote in other areas. Look at it in Iraq. You remember when they're proudly coming out with the dye on their fingers, purple. They were risking their lives to go out and vote. And in Canada, we're saying there's not enough polling stations. It's hard for them to get out. Oh, too bad. Come on. You get people telling you about the voting day literally every day for a month during a campaign. You have all the information in the world. You will never, aside from some rural spots, you're never going to live more than a 5-minute drive tops from your polling station. And as I said, parties, you phone up any of them. If they got a good campaign and say, hey, I need a ride to the polling booth, they'll send a volunteer out there to get you and drive you right to it and drive you back home again. They'll do it. So no, we don't need all these extra things and means and ideas to try and get people out to vote. The thing that's keeping people out to vote is the feeling that it doesn't make a difference. It's a feeling that the system might be broken. That's what keeps the voting down. If people feel their vote actually matters, they'll go out and vote. If they feel they're putting that vote into a system that can be trusted, they'll go out and vote. So, they're going about it the wrong way. They're putting in more things that'll make us trust it even less, and voter turnouts are going to continue to go down. And I think, unfortunately, some unprincipled people and politicians want that. They want that low turnout. They thrive on it. Apathy is their friend. But I tell you what, cynicism and apathy is not our friend. They call it participatory democracy. That's because we have to participate in it. We do. We got to get off our butts. As frustrating as it is, as much as it doesn't feel like it's doing anything, it's up to us. Because if we don't take advantage of it, we do lose those rights. Again, I mentioned it on the pipeline the other day, but I still thought it was really striking. I went to a public meeting a group that was organizing things. I was just observing. When things happen, I watch. And one of the statements that came out, because somebody from the audience questioned, because it's been a big issue about the libraries and these readings, drag queen story hours and things like that people get upset about in front of the kids. And the speaker at this event said, okay, everybody in the room, raise your hand if you've been a member of a board on a library. And 100 and some people there, not a single hand went up. So you live in your area. If you're concerned about your library, did you know you can just go down and join the board? That's one of those things that actually, I'm sure when they have their meeting, there's only a dozen people there, and anybody who raises their hand will be on the board. You can take control of it calmly, quietly, by taking part within your local library, much more effectively than being outside screaming with Larry Heather and some other folks protesting and waving signs. But you got to get out and do it. That's the thing. And if you don't, somebody will also take care of it. So the hard left, the far left have figured this out. They know this. Why do they even get in at these drag queen story hours? Well, because they have their people on the board. So get in there then. Don't let them own the board. You have just as much right to it as well. And again, I'm not that concerned about it anyways. I mean, I wouldn't send my kids to it, but I mean, these things are voluntary. If we get into the schools, which again, there just seems to be no end to these moral challenges and issues, well, then we got more stuff to battle about. But the library issue, democracy, things in general, guys, it's up to us. And we've got the power, but often we let it go on ourselves. And speaking of, even if the government means well, so I'm going to get started into some of these new, news stories for today as we move towards the guest. Bungled payroll, now $685 million. Yeah, so federally, of course, because no private companies screw up. They do that all the time. We know that. But to the degree of, oops, we screwed up payroll by $685 million. No, that takes government to get to that level of incompetence. And that's what happened. I guess federal employees were shortchanged by screwed up payroll software. And it's cost $685 million to try and fix. Now, this is the Phoenix payroll system. You might have heard about it before. You might be surprised that it's still actually in operation. This thing has been a disaster since day one. And hey, again, I will call out initiatives no matter which party. This was Stephen Harper when he was in power, when this thing was brought in back, I believe, in 2016. And this thing has cost $2.6 billion in ongoing fixes to this software. Really? Speaking again of inquiries, of corruption, of problems, how on earth do you pump $2.6 billion into a payroll system? I mean, that money is leaking out somewhere. Somebody's pocketing a whole lot of cash, and you're not even getting the results. And again, these are the same clowns that want to have a digitized form of managing the election. These are the same morons that put together the ArriveCan app, which cost millions and millions of dollars as well, that probably could have been done by some software geek in a basement for $100,000. So entrusting this government that can't even pay themselves, can't even pay their own staff, can't come up with a payroll system. Thousands of companies around the world, maybe millions, that have payroll systems that pay their staff. This isn't unprecedented. Yet somehow our government's completely incapable of doing it right and getting a software system to work. And they want to get more software systems to manage our elections. Look, I feel for some federal employee if their paycheck bounces or is paying them half the amount it's supposed to. But I'm much more concerned about a government screwing up our elections. As I said, it's everything. If we can't select our representatives, if we don't have that power, if it's not an efficient system, we're up the creek. So these little things, they slide under the radar. We got everything else going on in the CCP, election interference, and that. Meanwhile, the government is bringing in electronic means where they don't need to in our electoral system. And we should all be very, very, very concerned about that. Here's another one. So there's a Privy Council office. That's basically the Prime Minister's office. And they spend a lot of money on studies. There's so many rackets that go on in Ottawa. I tell you, there's so many people make so much money doing these commissions, these studies, and all these things all the time. This one was, I guess they studied about the First Nations people about, well, how do you guys feel about the new holiday that Prime Minister Trudeau gave you in recognition of residential schools? The new one that he went surfing the first time we held it. Well, they have mixed feelings. It sounds like most of them were just like along the lines of, Yeah, we're more concerned about not having clean water and some of the other problems that are going on rather than a feel-good holiday with a bunch of people in orange shirts. Thanks. But will the government pay attention? They have a lack of high-speed internet, crime rates, and strained relations with law enforcement. No amount of holidays, I'll go on a side rant, but I'll tell you, I'm going to say it outright too, something that not enough politicians, not enough people have the courage to say. The native reserve system is broken. It's fundamentally broken. It's not going to work. It can't work. We have people living in isolated areas without means of income that just sit there. And they've been victimized by some bad policy in the past. They used to have to get permits to leave the reserves. There was residential school abuses. There was things that happened. And we've got some very troubled, socially dysfunctional people stuck on these racial enclaves, separated from everybody else. And then we seem to keep expressing shock that the crime rates are high, the substance abuse rates are high, the graduation rates are low, the suicide rates are high. Every measure, you can check it out. I wrote a column on that years ago, and I dug into it. Every possible socioeconomic measure of prosperity or well-being on reserve is lower than the average, and a lot lower. Victims of crime as well as perpetrators of crime. It's just a mess. We have to accept, and it used to drive me nuts when I would work in the oil fields, and I'd go to those isolated areas and I would see the conditions, and they're getting worse and worse. And it's not for lack of money. We're pumping more and more funding into those reserves every year. It's not working. It's a black hole. And the people living on those reserves are suffering. Recent stories we saw in the news, it's tragic, it's terrible. Wild dogs, or at least uncontained dogs, have been attacking children. This story isn't new. This has been happening in reserves across Canada. Nowhere else in Canada do you have feral, wild, vicious dog problems like that, except on reserves. And it's been going on for a long time. This was happening outside of Calgary, and it's still happening on the Slayton Reserve. That's just a few miles up the road from where I live. My neighbors find dogs wandering on their property all the time. And there were problems with it. The dogs were harassing fishermen. I remember this a few years back in Calgary. And it was the bylaw enforcement guy. They used to call him Bylaw Bill, I think it was. And there were problems with these dogs were hassling fishermen on the Elbow River or Fish Creek and through there because they were coming off the reserve, these feral dogs, and they're getting dangerous. And what this Bylaw Bill clown comes up with and says, well, the reason for this is because people from Calgary have been driving onto the reserve and dumping unwanted dogs there. What a load of crap. What a load of hooey. I mean, talk about diverting from the responsibility of what happened on how this came about. Look, guys, again, it's not a matter of pointing fingers of blame. Like, the reality is you've got people living on the reserve who are in bad condition. And yes, getting their dogs spayed or neutered isn't a high priority for them. So the dogs run wild, they breed, and then they don't take care of the new puppies and they go out there and become feral. But to make up a story as if people have been driving out there and dumping, why would you go out of your way to go to a reserve to dump a dog? Dogs get dumped, I understand that, but the losers who do that, they don't care. They will drive to whatever the nearest rural road is and do it. So why doesn't Strathmore have an abandoned dog problem? Why doesn't Okotoks have an abandoned problem? Any of the areas around Calgary, the only one that has a problem is the reserve. Why is it that there's wild dog problems in distant northern reserves? Onion Lake, and when I was up there, man, the wild dogs were brutal out that way. Are people driving hours from Edmonton just to abandon their dogs there? No. But we've got this attitude of denial, this attitude of fostering more irresponsibility and not following through, not recognizing that the system is broken, it's not working. And we have public officials making those excuses. It's wrong, and it's not serving the people living on the reserves, and it's not serving us. Nobody's winning. So when we get these ongoing studies to the Privy Council, as I said, things like that, saying that yes, having a new holiday doesn't seem to make people living on the reserves more content. Well, no, that's because their problems run a heck of a lot more deeply than having an orange shirt day at the local school. So we're going to go to our guest pretty soon. I'm going to run a quick ad before we do so, and then we'll have a conversation with Philip Slayton. So just hang in there, guys.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.
Hello, Mr. Slayton. Thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Corey. How are you?
Very good, thanks. So I did read your fine book cover to cover there. I appreciate it being sent out. It's on a subject, of course, that's as I said, kind of at the start of the show, it's existed since the first Jews came about. But you've kind of taken a bit of a different approach, at least with addressing anti-Semitism and in more of the modern context.
Yes, I have. I've tried to place anti-Semitism, which, of course, as you know, has been around for a long time. I've tried to place it in the context of modern identity politics, modern social media, the rise of populism, other things that are happening in the world today, and see how all those things fit together.
Yeah, and you kind of begin, almost, I guess, in a controversial sense, into the almost to some degree, the anti-Semitism has been woven into the Jewish identity, and it's actually one of the things that's helped keep Jews united when they're spread all over the place, even if it's such an odious concept.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, a number of people, including, for example, Jean-Paul Sartre, have said that it's really anti-Semitism more than anything else that keeps Jews together. And if you look at Jews through the world, they're a very disparate community in many respects. They have a variety of different views. Some are religious, but most are not. Some support Israel, but some do not. And within Israel, as we've seen recently, there's all kinds of groups from different backgrounds, with different beliefs, with different degrees of religion, that spend a lot of time fighting each other. So when you look at these very disparate communities within Israel, around the world, you say, well, what gives it identity? And one of the views is, I think it's an important view, is that it's anti-Semitism. The fact that for some strange reason, a lot of other people don't like the Jews and Jewish community, that's what drives the Jewish community together.
Yeah, and it's something I noticed year after year, we're hearing when it comes to reported incidents of racism, for example, anti-Semitism tends to top the list. But I mean, aside from very high profile things like the horrific, shootings in Pittsburgh and things such as that, is it a matter, though, of a lot more things are being reported? Because we're not really, I don't really see it on the ground as much. I mean, people are reporting microaggressions or relatively minor incidents.
Well, I mean, I think there is, of course, expressions of anti-Semitism quite often in different places around the world, including within our own country. But my view is that some of them are of relatively small consequence and not to be given huge weight. They don't mean that another Holocaust is around the corner. And one criticism I would make of some members of the Jewish community is they tend to overblow and exaggerate these incidents in a way that's not healthy and doesn't help the Jewish community or any community. Now, I understand why people do this. I mean, we still live under the shadow of the Holocaust. There are still a lot of people who are very nervous about how Jews have been treated and could be treated in the future. But I do think a more discerning way of considering expressions of anti-Semitism is a good thing. And I think the response to expressions of anti-Semitism needs to be proportional. Not everything is a deep, dark, terrible tragedy that foretells doom and gloom. Some things are not. So to answer your point, I think anti-Semitism continues, but the degree of it and the importance of it and the significance of it can be exaggerated.
Well, yeah, I mean, we see issues again. I mean, it can spawn more vitriolic or dangerous things. But I mean, I weigh in on the sewage of Twitter quite often, and I'll have some clown come on, who's going to talk about how the Jews brought down the World Trade Center, and I just block them and move on. I mean, this is just a nutcase with a keyboard. So I mean, it's still odious and offensive, but it isn't necessarily going to turn into something major. But I mean, how do you distinguish between what's just the lone crazy out there or what's part of a larger thing that could lead to a bigger problem?
Well, I mean, I think you have to be discerning and careful when you look at and when you evaluate examples of anti-Semitism. And in my book, for example, I discuss what I describe as 4 different kinds of anti-Semitism, ranging from incivility, stupidity on the internet, the kind of thing you just described, which is unpleasant. I mean, no one's saying it's okay to do that. It's not okay to do that. It's unpleasant. And of course, it can lead to other things. But nonetheless, let's see it for what it is, which is often very inconsequential acts of incivility perpetrated by silly, stupid, ignorant people. So that's one kind. But then, of course, there's other kinds as well. And you can go through to the ultimate, most dangerous kind, which is when anti-Semitism of some kind or other is incorporated in government policy, in legislation, in statutes, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. There's a range of things. And I think you have to accept that it's a range, look at what's happened, be discerning, be proportionate in your response, and not treat everything, CORY, as if it's the end of the world.
Yeah, so the most, I guess, divisive problem or area we have going on right now is views on Israel, Zionism,
Yes.
whether or not the state is sustainable as it is. I mean, that's dividing even the Jewish community.
Very much so.
You go a lot into detail on that one, but it seems to be one of those ones that feels almost insurmountable as well. I mean, you brought up Kashmir, up in northern Pakistan, which probably my grandchildren will be watching disputes going on up there as well. But it is our modern, our largest issue right now.
Well, it's a hugely important issue, and it's one, as you know, that's been getting worse in recent times. And it's an issue that divides the Jewish community very severely, and not just the Jewish community. But one thing I feel very strongly about is that to criticize some Israeli policy, for example, to criticize the extensive settlement of the West Bank by Israel, is not to be anti-Semitic. There's a tendency, particularly among some parts of the Jewish community, to conflate anti-Zionism, opposition to certain policies of the Israeli government, particularly, let's say, the West Bank, with anti-Semitism. I reject that. It's perfectly acceptable to criticize government policy and government actions, and that does not equate with being anti-Semitic, although many people do make that equation.
Well, I mean, there's political merit, as a guy who talks about a lot of political things. If you want to try and shut down a conversation, that's a good way just to say, well, we don't want to go there because that would be anti-Semitic if you dare criticize that. But I mean, every government should be able to be critiqued. Yeah. But do you think perhaps traditional then Jewish support for Zionism might be fading? I mean, you talk a lot about that, the different types of Jews. I mean, whether they're secular, whether they're religious. A large part of what the sticking point is of course, the Temple Mount. I mean, the second coming isn't going to happen unless the Jews are there at that time, at least as far as the scriptures are concerned. So I would imagine observant Jews are going to be very unwilling to give up on that. But at the same time, when you're getting a larger move towards secularism, perhaps that support's crumbling.
Well, I mean, let's look at two communities. Let's look at first Jews in Israel. And even within Israel, as we've seen recently, there's tremendous division about the acceptability of various government policies, including settlement of the West Bank. Not all Jews in Israel favor extending or even maintaining existing West Bank settlements. But if you go to the United States, where almost half the world's Jews live, within the United States, I think there's growing opposition, particularly among young Jews, to much of what Israel has done and is doing. Young Jews tend to be more secular. They tend to be on the whole left of center. They tend to be supporters, for example, of movements like Black Lives Matter. And when they see what they regard as human rights violations by Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians, they don't like it. And they ask themselves, well, can I really support, as my family has, for example, has traditionally supported, can I really support a state that does this kind of thing? I wouldn't do it within my own country, the United States, and I don't want to do it vis-a-vis Israel. So I think there's a real prospect of much of the support of the U.S. Jewish community for Israel, which has been extremely important to Israel over a long period of time, very important, fading, and that's a dangerous thing for the state of Israel.
So, I mean, you talked about a lot of interesting things, like the potential of going back. People mention that often, like Morocco, there was a large Jewish population that was getting along quite well with a dominant Muslim culture and leadership. So, I mean, it is possible historically. And you're saying that even, some of the older Moroccans are, wistfully looking back on the days of when they had the Jewish brethren there. But are the younger Muslim kids, as you state a lot, most of them have never even met a Jew, and they're basing their opinions on social media or portrayals, and that's not helping either.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there was a very important and large Jewish population in Morocco, which essentially left Morocco at the end of the 1940s after the creation of the State of Israel and went to Israel, where, by the way, they weren't very well treated for quite some time. They were Sephardic Jews, and the Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe looked down upon them and regarded them as, on the whole, inferior people. So that's a whole other story. But meanwhile, the Moroccans, the state of Morocco in particular, has been, I think, quite wistful about the departure of the Jews, particularly older Moroccans. And the Moroccan government, the king of Morocco, has been very favorable to Israel and very favorable to the Jewish tradition that remains in Morocco. So it's a complicated picture, Corey. And I might add, for example, it tends to be a reaction sometimes that Arabs and Jews are natural born enemies, at each other's throats given half the chance. This is not the case. There are many similarities between the two religions, and historically, often the Muslims have sheltered Jews who had to flee other parts of the world. So it's a complicated history, and a lot of the sort of shibboleths that are put around are simply not true. They're just that, shibboleths, not true.
Well, yeah, as you said, though, and part of the historic problem is the fluidity, though, of acceptance of Jews among populations, decade by decade or generation by generation. Let's say, for example, Morocco's been sounding very friendly, and a Jewish population moved back, but we don't know if another 3 election cycles or a revolution comes along and suddenly you're getting chased back. Like, you can see where the value of Israel as one sanctuary could hold a lot of appeal to Jews.
Well, that is the fundamental idea, of course. By the way, I don't think any Moroccan Jews, or very few, are going to leave, who are in Israel now, are going to leave and go back. That's very unlikely.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, the fundamental idea of Israel, of course, was giving a people who had been chased around the world and persecuted around the world for a long time a place of refuge. That is the compelling idea. It's an extremely attractive idea. And of course, it was given a huge moral force following World War II and the Holocaust. It was a hugely kind of moral debt that the world seemed to think or thought had to be paid by supporting the creation of the State of Israel. Very compelling and attractive idea. But the reality on the ground now, after such a long period of time, is somewhat different. It's more complicated, it's more nuanced, and the morals, the rights and wrongs are not as obvious as they once were.
Well, and something of an irony you point out in the book is Israel was actually kind of provided a place that helped with anti-Semitic governments around the world, because they would, we can chase these guys out of here. They got somewhere to go. Let's somewhere to put these Jews and get them out of our own hair. Thus, not for the next necessarily best of intentions, but a lot of nations were supporting the ongoing state of Israel.
Yes, I think that's true. That's a historical fact.
Which is unfortunate. So, I mean, getting, as you said, it's nuanced, it's complicated. I mean, you talk a bit about it, the different types of states or possible visions for Israel. Like, a solution-based approach is really difficult on this still, though. I mean, what could you envision that might fix this?
Well, it is very difficult. And of course, a lot of people of goodwill have tried for a long time to figure out some way whereby the problem of the Middle East, the problem of Israel, Palestine, the West Bank, all of that could be fixed. I mean, most recently, for quite some time now, was the so-called two-state solution, whereby there'd be a Palestinian state, a proper standalone autonomous state with its own sovereignty, and of course Israel. That's been tried. Various people have endorsed it, but it hasn't really gone anywhere. And I think the general view is it's been quite subverted now by the settlements, Jewish settlements on the West Bank. An idea that I think has some merit, I call the Canadian solution, although it's not original to me, is the idea of a federation, 2 states, yes, but a federation over the top of them, guaranteeing, as between the 2 states, the Arab state and the Israeli state, freedom of movement, certain economic freedoms, human rights, and so on. And within that federation, each individual state would have huge autonomy and power, much the same as we have in this country. You as an Albertan might push back a bit against that, I'm not sure, but you know what I'm talking about. Now, that would be enormously difficult to construct. It would require a lot of goodwill and a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of careful thought, but it's not impossible, I don't think. And what I do think is that the situation in the Middle East, the situation on the West Bank, Palestine, Gaza, and so on, is going from bad to worse. We see that. It's untenable. It's extremely dangerous, and only misery and destruction can result from it. And so the world has to try and do what it can to figure out some way to fix this or ameliorate it.
Yeah, and it is radiating outwards. I mean, whether fairly or unfairly, we've got incentivized people protesting against Israel, say, in North American universities. And unfortunately, sometimes that is translating to abuse upon Jewish students who had nothing to do with it. We see those incidents or hear of them occasionally. I mean, there's tensions that spread outside of Israel and into other areas that really shouldn't be impacted so directly by it.
Yes, I think that's true. And there is a kind of a tainting effect goes on. I mean, one crisis tends to lead to other crises. So I think the world the world now is so distracted by what's happening in Ukraine, by what's happening in China, Russia, and all of that, that attention that for some time was focused on the Middle East seems to have shifted. But the Middle East remains a real danger point, a real flashpoint, and also a place where, in my judgment, this is controversial. Many people strongly disagree with me, but nonetheless, a place where you do see serious infringements of human rights, particularly the human rights of the Palestinians. And that needs to be dealt with in some way or other. But it'll be hard, Corey. It'll be hard.
Well, and we'd have to be careful. I mean, Israel is a nuclear power, and if things really broke out into a very large scale, I mean, I think everybody's armed enough, again, that it wouldn't be a 6-day war this time unless something terrible happened, and we could really see things get a heck of a lot worse over there.
Yeah, I mean, the big fear there, of course, is a war between Israel and Iran, which is from time to time seems to be a possibility, but I wouldn't make a prediction about that.
Yeah, we just kind of hope for the best on that front. So, I mean, you spoke a little broadly too, just on a bigger issue altogether. I mean, it's kind of a societal thing. It's something for those of us in the comfort of North America and Europe is identity politics. So, I mean, some people, I guess it's a bit of a natural tendency towards tribalism or our team and this and that. And people are embracing Jewish identity just to stand out because they want to say, well, I'm this or I'm that and I'm oppressed or I'm not. It's a trend that's troubling outside of just the matter of Judaism. I mean, I think it's
true. I mean, identity politics is really sweeping the world. Everybody is seeking to very carefully define their own particular identity, which is fine. I have no difficulty with that. And there are good reasons for doing it in some cases. But what I regret is that this is often done at the expense of what makes us all the same, what binds us together. I mean, there are things that separate us for sure, and that's fine. But there are also things that bind us together, common objectives that we have, common problems we face no matter what our identity is. And what I regret is that identity politics, as it grows and becomes more and more powerful, as it is doing, it tends to obscure and hide and devalue what makes us all the same, what binds us together, and with the common problems we need to solve together. I mean, climate change is an obvious example. Climate change doesn't care what race you are, what color you are, or anything like that. It's a problem everybody faces, and we shouldn't embrace ideas that make it more difficult for us to deal with issues like that. I mean, I sometimes like to remind people of what Barack Obama said, I think it was in 2004 in a speech to the Democratic National Convention, when he said, there's no such, this is Barack Obama speaking, there's no such thing, I'm paraphrasing, there's no such thing as white Americans, there's no such thing as Black Americans, there's no such thing as Latino Americans, there are only Americans. Well, that was less than 20 years ago, but it now sounds almost medieval because people don't think like that, regrettably. They think of their particular identity and they repudiate any attempt by people who don't share that identity to comment on it, to relate to it, to say that they have some understanding and sympathy with it. They don't want to know. It's lived experience. You haven't lived my experience, you can't understand me at all. I reject that.
Yes, well, what we need is at least, at the very least, more frank discussions in tender areas. As you said, yes, a lot of what you've covered is controversial, and I imagine some of the feedback you've gotten as a man of Jewish descent has been heated. That's part of the fun of being in the public sphere. But if we don't want to talk about it, we're certainly not going to find any solutions.
Well, that's right. I mean, above all else, Corey, we have to talk about it, and we have to listen to what the other person has to say and not reject what they say just because we don't like them, we don't like where they've come from. We have to listen to what they have to say And we have to kind of reach, where possible, a compromise. And if somebody is putting forward a bad argument, the way to respond to that bad argument is not to shut that person down, not to deplatform them, not to denigrate them, but to tell them, to give them a good argument that replaces their bad argument. And that's dialogue. That's how civilization advances. That's how a liberal democratic country like ours survives.
Well, and there was a lot of fantastic stuff packed into that book that you put together. So I really appreciate that. And you're coming on to talk to us about it. Before I let you go, where can people find a copy should they want to get out and get theirs?
Well, they can find it at the usual places, CORY. They can find it at the local bookstore. They can get it from Amazon. They can get it directly from the publisher, Sutherland House. I hopefully, or they can download it on their Kindle. Hopefully, it's not that difficult to get.
Excellent. Yeah, there's lots of ways to get the books now. You don't even have to leave the house anymore. Well, thank you again. And hopefully maybe we'll talk down the road and it'll be over having seen a breakthrough and some great solutions on this.
Well, that would be wonderful, CORY. Thanks. I enjoyed this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. So just a reminder again, that was Philip Slayton. He is the author of Antisemitism, An Ancient Hatred in the Age of Identity Politics. And it's a really good read. It's very well sourced. And it's a lot of food for thought. I mean, I don't necessarily have to agree with every point or such, but he's digging in areas that people don't want to talk about. I mean, Zionism, you don't get much more contentious than that. And to some people, it's a very deeply held conviction. And you've got two very dedicated groups, both dedicated to wanting that same piece of land and whether there's going to be a solution. I mean, eventually I think there will, but how long and how painful will it be to get to that, I don't know. But it's a good, frank discussion in that book, and I do recommend it as a read. It's worthwhile. All right, well, let's turn the page and talk about some other news things rather than some world issues. Speaking of a zero risk world, here's some of the stuff, trends. So, we talked about identity politics. It's a trend I really, can't stand. It's divisive. It's harming us on so many levels in so many ways. But this idea that somehow if the government could just manage us strongly enough, we won't come to any kind of risk. That's why when there was a pandemic going on, it was just assumed that the solution to the pandemic is government. It's more control. It's them somehow. They can control a disease. As I said earlier in the show, they can't even control their payroll system. They can't control a disease. But we see everything, the fun police too. They come after everything, anything you enjoy. I mean, we saw that too, is Health Canada is saying now you shouldn't have any alcohol whatsoever, ever, but if you must, no more than 2 drinks a week. Come on. Look, and again, I've been frank about it. I can't drink. I mean, I drank a hell of a lot, used my privileges, got to the point where I had to fully dry out. I'm an alcoholic. I accept that. I know that. I'm recovered. I haven't had a drink in 4 years, and I won't again. But other people can, and they can enjoy it. And I have no problem with that. And I understand that maybe they had 6 or 7 and got tipsy, but you know what? They had fun. And oh, yes, I know it wasn't the healthiest thing, but not everything has to be perfectly healthy. Ice cream. There's no need to eat ice cream. It's definitely not necessarily good for you in any sort of way, but it's a matter of moderation and risk benefit. Okay, yes, it's not the healthiest, but I'm going to enjoy some of it because I want to sacrifice a bit of my health without hurting it. So what I'm getting at with this one is this story saying sledding. They're going after people on toboggans now. Yeah, this is the Public Health Agency data, and they're saying it's even riskier than snowboarding. You know that. We know that. Yes. I mean, how many people have we known as kids? You go down a stupid slope and a kid broke his arm because they smacked into a tree on a toboggan, or they smacked into each other, or it flipped, or older people had some drinks, got onto a big inner tube, went down and threw their back out. Or even sometimes, I'm certain, some people have been killed tobogganing. We want to do things to reduce the risk. Let's try and avoid tobogganing while drunk. Let's not stick your kids on a toboggan slope that crosses a road or has a bunch of trees on it. But let's have a little fun, you guys. Come on. Why have you got to come down on everything? I mean, talk about Canadian traditions. I am not a fan of winter, Hey, and I grew up in Banff. I was a skier. I was a mediocre ski jumper. I enjoyed a whole lot of ski jumping. By the way, a side note, check it out. there's a female ski jumper. No, her name's escaping me. I'm so awful with names. But if you Google it and look at it, she's fantastic. She won the world championship. She's only 19 years old, and she won the female set the world record ski flying championships. I know I bounce around on this show. That's the way it goes. 222 meters that young lady jumped. And they just watch the video. It's amazing. She flies. Fantastic sport. I hope it starts to really make a comeback in Canada and grow. It's a lot of fun. It's great for kids. It's not as risky as people would think it is. But getting back to this, there is a little bit of risk. Sure there is. That's part of the element. That's part of the excitement for the viewer and the jumper. So many things. How many things do we enjoy in life that come with a little bit of degree of risk that we think about and we accept, that I will accept that there's this bit of risk so I can have this bit of enjoyment. So yes, you can reduce your chances of injury from ski jumping to zero by not ski jumping, but you'll never get to enjoy it. You can reduce the risk of tobogganing injuries to zero by never doing it. But what the hell else are you going to do in winter? As I was getting to when I started with, I hate winter. I can't stand it. I'm sick of the slippery sidewalks. I'm sick of the dark nights, the cold, the wet, the brown trees. Yeah, I know. Hey, what kind of Canadian am I? It's just the way it is. And the older I get, the grumpier I get, the more I dislike winter. But if there's things that'll make it a little more fun for kids and others to get out toboggan, let them do it. But no, these fun police, they put out these studies and talk about how dangerous it is. And some sort of marching mamas and Karens are probably going to stop their kids from tobogganing and enjoying themselves in winter because of that crap. Come on, guys. We don't need government in every aspect of our lives. There's no zero risk world. Quit trying to achieve it. I mean, don't be stupid either. Or maybe do be stupid. I mean, come on, think about it. One of our problems has been not enough people die of stupidity anymore. They don't. In fact, they breed. The dumber they are, the more kids they tend to have. And they get government jobs or welfare. You know, the reason we came and evolved the way we did, because, you know, you had the nomadic people of 1,000,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago or whatever it was. And you know what? If there was a moron in the tribe, chances were he was going to eat a bad plant or fall off a cliff and never had the chance to have a kid. So eventually the smarter ones kept rising and breeding with smarter ones. Well, we're going the other way now. Now, we don't want to go into eugenics and knocking off the stupid purposely, but, you know, maybe we can take some of the warning labels off the bleach. That's all I'm saying. Sometimes a problem will take care of itself. I mean, I'll talk in a similar way. It's a statement I use. I see a poll showed that a majority of Canadians, you know, I'm going to bounce into a whole new issue here. A majority of Canadians now are supporting reinstating the death penalty for murder. I'm not with the majority here. I know, as a conservative-minded person, you know, how can you not support it? Because I don't trust the damn government. I'm more libertarian than conservative when it comes to that. I don't trust the government to get it right. Like I said, like I pointed out, they can't even pay themselves. I don't want them with the power of life and death over our citizens. And when I have those debates with people online, they say, oh, but look at the cases where it's 100% for sure. Really? Like David Milgaard? I mean, he came very close to being hung. Likewise, people say with DNA, it proves it beyond a doubt. Really? You think it's impossible for DNA to get contaminated? If you look it up, there's some cases, I believe it was in New England in the United States. I watched a big documentary on that, and it was frightening. There's like a central crime lab in Massachusetts, it was, but it was being run by a completely incompetent doctor. She was screwing up samples and making a mess of things all over the place for years. People's lives were in the balance. This is criminal lab work, and the samples were not reliable. The integrity was lost. So no, we cannot have 100% certainty in these cases. When it comes to execution, there's no going back. If you, oh geez, we were wrong. You can't dig him up and reanimate him. If he's locked up, and I want to see true life sentences. Hey, I want justice reform. I want bail reform. I want the repeat violent criminals locked up for life. And I mean life. You're a repeat violent criminal. You've murdered a couple people and you're 20 years old. I don't care if it takes 80 years for you in prison. I want you in prison until you die. But at least if it turns out 40 years from now, we did find out, oh, geez, we did screw that one up. Okay, well, you still got a few years left outside of prison. We can settle on it. But if we've executed him, we can't do anything about it. So yes, I just can't support returning to the death penalty. I can't. How can you say that you support that and say you don't trust the government at the same time? That's the biggest thing in the world you can trust them with then. I don't want them having the ability to kill me. Bad enough. So, but getting into what I was talking about, letting the stupid or taking the labels off the bleach, I was just saying too, Yeah, if they're a bad enough criminal and so on, I mean, I wouldn't be too sad if, they left their shoelaces on their shoes when they were left alone in the cell as well. If they want to take care of things themselves, it's not our place to get in the way of them. There's some of the irony. We get such a strong suicide watch to some of the worst people we've got that are incarcerated in our facilities, but at the same time, the government's bending over backwards to provide medically assisted death to everybody who is feeling a little depressed for a while or having a bad month, or even sometimes the case of minors. I think the priorities of this government are screwed up. But again, see, remember that. This is a government that doesn't value human life the right way all the time. So don't give them the power to take those lives, even in the criminal thing. I know we've seen cases where the guy is saying, I did it. I'm a loser. I'm a scumbag. I'm a murderer. I'm a pedophile. There is virtually no doubt. Well, that's fine. Let's get a prison facility. Let's stick it up in the Northwest Territory. Let's weld that door shut and never have that person out reoffending ever again. But don't give the government the power to kill people. They're too stupid. They're too inept. And it's too big a power for them. Let's see. Here's another one. This ought to stir some things up. There's a parliamentary committee that's recommending the cabinet embraces closer ties to Taiwan. If we're talking about sticking points with Zionism in Israel, well, China and Taiwan, of course, is the huge one. This is the one where the Chinese interference comes in the most, where the Chinese get upset most often in the most vigorous way is anytime any country recognizes Taiwan's independence. That's when China gets upset. And Canada has been so limp-wristed, so weak when it comes to China. That's what we've seen. China, politicians, Trudeau in particular, and and over the years, actually, Canada has been notoriously weak when it comes to dealing with China. But in this case, this is a case of a Commons vote endorsing Taiwan's bid for membership in the World Health Organization. I know we have a separate discussion. Careful what you wish for Taiwan, but either way, it certainly adds a level of the credibility of Taiwan as an independent state. The Chinese are going to be ticked off about this. And good on them. And it's good. I mean, it's good to see a little bit of backbone being shown from a committee for what it's worth on an international issue, particularly when it deals with China, because we just haven't seemed to be able to find the courage to be able to do that in the past. So, hey, good on you. We'll see what happens. Maybe Trudeau will get publicly chewed out by Xi Jinping again, as he did at that other world gathering, and embarrass himself. I'll break down that. Actually, that I was just seeing some more of the stuff on that poll. See, I'm offside with Albertans sometimes. 62% of support capital punishment, and Saskatchewan and Manitoba are next to 60%. Because where all provinces are dealing with some pretty high crime rates these days. Ontario and BC, 58 and 55 in Atlantic Canada. Quebec's where it's the lowest, 43%. But I think that's just because they don't want to execute. They just want to deport their criminals and send them out for the rest of the country to deal with, kind of like they do with their credit card bills. Here's a neat one. A report from Environment and Climate Change Canada said Ontario and Quebec have the poorest water quality in Canada. Okay, it's unfortunate. In fact, over 20 years, they showed, from 2002 to 2020, you'd think with modern tech and everything, there'd be improvement. No, not a single site showed improved water quality. Alberta is constantly in headline news because of our oil sands stuff and the settling ponds. So you got to remember, these are tailings ponds. There's not nice water in them. But I mean, it's not pure cyanide either, guys. This big leak that everybody's ripping their hair out about that happened recently, it was the equivalent of 2 swimming pools over the course of months. And again, we want to have zero leaks. Fair enough. That's the goal. That's the intention. But look at all the crap that Alberta's dealt with over that. Meanwhile, Ontario and Quebec have the worst water quality in Canada. And guess why? Because they dump their raw sewage in their rivers, and they've been doing it for over 100 years. We're the bad guys out here, where we have 101 levels of environmental monitoring and cleaning and reclamation requirements and things like that. But Ontario, Quebec, and Victoria, by the way, the other little left coast there, dump raw sewage into the waterways. Raw, straight out, corn and all, guys. But we're the bad guys. Keep that in mind, the usual double standard of things. Let's see, another thing, Canada Revenue Agency report found that the underground economy is going to continue to grow without consistent federal surveillance. Well, that's what I worry about. You see, they're calling for more government, but of course, that's what they do. They showed all cash and other tax avoidance measures increased in the last 5 years by 50%. It's interesting because that also shows people losing faith in government because they you hear from the left, oh, I'd be happy to go pay my taxes because it gives so many great social programs. It's good for everybody. Most people are saying, no, the government's a big parasite, and the more I can avoid giving to them, the better. They don't trust the government. They don't like the government. They don't want to support the government. They might like the one party that's in power, but they still don't like the government as a whole. So that avoidance is going to keep happening because there's no trust or liking for the government. I think it's kind of healthy to have that distrust. Finally, I'll finish up. Let's look all the way over to our East Coast. And PEI, they have an election coming, actually, April 3rd, their provincial one. And lo and behold, healthcare is their top issue. Yes, this is a full trifecta of it. Surgeons have been leaving, and people can't get a family doctor. They're having some serious issues out there in PEI. Well, yes, but then which province doesn't? I was dealing with a liberal fart catcher online the other day about that, going on about how awful the UCP has been, and Alberta's got waiting lists and everything. Well, wait a minute. It's the NDP next door in BC. They got the exact same problems. Every province in Canada has the same problems. When are we going to admit, speaking of frank talk, speaking of admitting problems and working towards a solution, Canada's healthcare system is broken, it's unsustainable, it's costing us a fortune, and the outcomes are getting worse and worse and worse. So we have to change the system. We've spent more money. Quit pointing at whatever your local party is, because they can't fix it. They can't. As long as they're working within a broken system, it will never work. Admit that, because nobody's found the solution. It's not like you could say, oh, look at that. Over in Ontario, they got no waiting lists at all. So they obviously are doing it right. We got to emulate that. Or in BC, they have all the doctors they need. Well, no, but that's not the case. They're running out of doctors and ambulances in BC under the NDP, and they are in Saskatchewan under the Saskatchewan Party, and they are in Quebec as well. So it's everywhere, guys, including PEI, where they have an election in a place basically smaller than the city of Calgary. But they have the same problem. So let's start talking about reforming the system, not just some of the policies or parties, because it's not going to change. All right, that's enough out of me. It's been a good, interesting day. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Keep an eye on here. The pipeline will be on a little later tonight. And check in next week. I will have a whole new show, a whole new guest, and we'll have a great whole new conversation. Thanks again.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access